This trip was a loop west from our home on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, west to Burke, then up to Barcaldine and Longreach, before turning east through Emerald and north to Bowen. From there we headed south, past the Whitsunday Islands, and then through Kingaroy and Toowomba and home through Casino. From home, we headed south through Newcastle, then on the Jerry's Plains for the night. And the next morning, we popped into Gulgong, on the way to staying at my daughter's farm over the weekend. From there we headed on to Warren, then northwest up to Burke, where we spent a few days there. And then we headed north to Kanamala. We pulled into Jerry's Plains free camping ground for the night, where it ended up getting down to 2 degrees. But the morning was fine as we head off towards Gulgong. Our granddaughter was on stage at the historic Prince of Wales Theatre. It was built in 1871, and the interior still looks much the same as it did then, I think. After spending the weekend with family for my daughter and grandson's birthday, we headed west to Warren and stopped in this well-looked-after caravan park. One of our gas cylinders was empty and we needed diesel, and Uncle Clary's gave us great service there. On the way in, we decided to do this walk. Plenty of options. Lots of birds. And the track was in pretty good order. There were some hides where it was easy to watch the birds. And there were several examples of where bark canoes had been cut from the trees. Now this old church now acts as the Arts and Crafts Centre, and next to it was the Information Centre, and there was lots of information boards there as well. Our next day's travel would take us to Burke, with a stop for morning coffee at Nyngan. At Nyngan there's a nice display of some of these old coaches, and also a large figure of a bogan. It's great that they don't take themselves too seriously. We stopped in Burke for 5 days and visited the Information Centre and the Back of Burke exhibition. The introduction was a great animated video.
The Darling River. They call it the second Mississippi here, can you believe it? It's little more than a muddy gutter at the moment, but when it's fed by something the locals call mysteriously the Queensland rains, then it becomes a mighty waterway.
There were lots of great exhibits, and it's well worth stopping there to have a look at it. Now, these women, they had to be tough. After viewing the exhibition, we had lunch at the cafe. Another day, we drove out the 70 kilometres to Little Mountain to walk up to the lookout. So we drove down south through Kidman's Way. Then we turned off onto the dirt of the Cunnamulla National Park and headed for the Dry Tank campground. This walk was much as you would expect, with red soil and a few climbs and steps. But then there's always something around to admire and have a rest. After a bit more of the climb, we arrived at the lookout. This view was just like many paintings you would see in the outback. On our walk back, we saw this emu, totally unworried by us. And then, on the drive out, we came upon this flock of emus. They got off the road in their own time. Now, visiting the local cemetery is always a good way to find out the history of the area, and we actually got a guide from the information centre. And of course it was a bit dry and dusty, as you would always expect out there. Now, these headstones tell you of the hard times people had out there, about the early deaths of children, about drownings, and about accidents. Some jobs have their own risks. And for some, I guess we'll never know about them. Now, of course, various races find their way out there, and there's even a small mosque here. In 1888, 3 children were killed in an accident on the way to the annual children's picnic. The Sisters of Mercy had a convent in Burke for over 100 years, and many of them are buried together in the cemetery. Another great person that was buried here was the great surgeon Fred Hollows. He worked to provide eye operations free to people. His saying was that an eye is an eye, doesn't matter who you are. Burke is built on the south bank of the Darling River, and it has had a great paddle boat history from when the river was the main highway. There were 3 wharfs in the heyday, and today one of them has been rebuilt. Now it still has to handle the floodwaters. Up on top today it's a nice bordered area with grass. Perhaps it was a bit different to when it was at the peak. There's also a nice old engine on display here. I imagine it was probably used to pump water. Across the river is the heritage area of the old port. After a short drive from town, the wharf comes into view. The water's high, but the redgums don't seem to mind that much. There's a little inlet with the paddle boat PS Wave that got stranded here in the flood in 1921. All that remains today are the paddle frames. We wanted to take a shortcut, but I think the river wins today. And this was actually just next to the water pumps. The old bridge north of Burke is now totally closed, sadly even to foot traffic. Our next drive north was up to Kanamala. In this case the road is basically straight for 250 kilometres. It is basically flat out there, but the vegetation does change a bit. In fact, it's quite green this year with all the rain. The town centre is very well kept. And opposite the local government, there's a statue in recognition of the song by Slim Dusty, called the Kanamala fella. Looking around town, we also find this tree that Robert Joseph Wells tried to hide in 1880. I think it probably had more foliage in those days. He was captured. In fact, he was the last person in Queensland to be hanged for robbery under arms. With rain and no sun, I had to run the generator for a couple of hours to charge the battery in the caravan, as we were free camping here. We took a drive from Cunnamulla out to Yulo, about 60k to the west. There were a few caravans stopped at the cafe in town. The First World War did not escape out here, and the town lost some of its young men. The local people were resourceful in finding ways to cross the river, especially with this truck. And World War II also reached here with an air raid shelter deemed necessary. The town also has mud baths and also a 6-foot tall life-size Diprotodon optatum